Russia is the largest country on Earth. Its territory spans 11 time zones, 2 continents, and 6.6 million square miles of land. That's 70% larger than the United States. But right now, a chunk of it the size of Australia is quietly being lost. Not to military defeat, not to invasion, people are leaving, and they are not coming back. This is all about the Russian Far East. More specifically, the Far Eastern Federal District, which covers 40% of Russia's entire territory. That entire span of land has only 8 million people, just over 5% of Russia's total population, and the number is falling faster than it has at any point in modern Russian history. Russian President Vladimir Putin has personally described this as a threat to national security, and he's right. The region is vital, not only for resources, but as an entry point for commerce and demographic migration from the east. But there's one big problem. As soon as the Kremlin tries to do something about it, the effort fails, and the Russian Far East continues to decline, slowly, steadily, inevitably. This creates the possibility of another incursion, this time by China into Russia, a historic reversal of the Russian Empire's gains in 1860. But we don't have to go back that far to demonstrate the scale of what is happening. We only need to look at the last 35 years. According to the 1989 census, what would become the Far Eastern Federal District had around 10.35 million people. When Putin came to power, that number was around 8.8 million. In 2025, the population was estimated at only 7.86 million. That's about a 25% loss over 35 years. But that top-line figure obscures how catastrophic the situation is in specific regions. Chukotka, the remote peninsula in Russia's far northeast, has lost 68% of its population since 1991. Magadan Oblast, once a hub of Soviet-era resource extraction, has lost 63.6%. Kamchatka is down 34.6%. These numbers indicate that the respective regions are essentially being abandoned, with no one to return. Since Putin came into power, the population dropped by 10%. And some statistics suggest another 8% decline by 2033. This was 3 times the official estimate made just a few years earlier. The rate of collapse is accelerating. The region today holds fewer people than it did in the mid-1970s. The Soviet state spent decades and enormous resources building the population up. In the 3 decades since, that work has been undone almost entirely. So why is this happening? The answer lies in a broken Soviet model that Moscow has been trying and failing to replicate ever since the Union collapsed. The USSR populated the Far East through a combination of methods, some of them deeply coercive. Gulag labor built the infrastructure of the early Soviet Far East, particularly in the Northeast. But the post-Stalin model relied on positive incentives. Wages in the region were 50% to 2 times higher than the national average. Workers who came east were guaranteed the right to housing in their home regions. That was a critical safety net in the Soviet housing system. The accumulated savings from the higher wages and relatively low cost of living essentially meant that the Far East was framed as a temporary sacrifice. It guaranteed future payoff back west, where life was easier, due to higher population density, better access to infrastructure, a more favorable climate. That system worked, even if it encountered setbacks, because it was direct. The state provided the incentives. The state controlled the institutional guarantees. The state funded the social infrastructure that made harsh conditions bearable. Net migration to the region was positive right up until the late 1980s. Then the Soviet Union collapsed, and with it, those foundational guarantees vanished almost overnight. Workers who had spent years in the East suddenly had no guaranteed housing rights back home. Their savings had been wiped out by inflation and the implosion of the financial system. The rational response was to leave immediately, while leaving was still possible. And that is exactly what they did. In 1991, for the first time in Soviet or Russian history, outmigration from the Far East exceeded natural population growth. But the exodus has never stopped. What makes the situation so difficult to reverse is that the reasons people leave today are not the same as the reasons they left in 1991. Back then, it was institutional collapse and financial panic. Today, it is a rational cost-benefit calculation where life in the Russian Far East is expensive, hard, dangerous, and comparatively unrewarding. And it's only getting worse. Let's start with the income axis. In the mid-1990s, wages in the Far East still carried a real premium over the national average, nominally around 71% higher, owing to Soviet-era coefficients and allowances that partially survived the transition. By the late 2010s, that advantage had dropped to just 18%. At the same time, the cost of living in the region remained dramatically higher than in Western Russia, 25 to 30% higher in the more accessible southern cities like Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, 40 to 60% higher in places like Kamchatka and Sakhalin, up to 80 to 100% higher in Chukotka. The arithmetic is straightforward. You earn marginally more. You pay substantially more. And the gap between what your wages are worth in the Far East versus what they would be worth in Novosibirsk or Moscow keeps narrowing. Then there is the quality of life. Life expectancy in the Far East lags 2 to 3 years behind the national average, which is itself not impressive. Crime rates are higher than the rest of Russia. The poverty rate sits at 15.7% in the Far Eastern Federal District compared to 12.6% nationally. Healthcare has been consolidated away from small settlements, making it functionally inaccessible to many people in the region. By 2015, the number of students in some sub-regions had fallen to just 25 to 30% of 1990 levels. The system's response was to shut schools, which then drove more families out, creating a positive feedback loop with extremely negative results. So the people who are on the fence and have the means to leave look at the worsening state and decide to take their chances elsewhere. The people who stay are disproportionately older, poorer, and more dependent on state transfers. This translates into a shrinking tax base where the local budgets are increasingly used to support the aging population with healthcare and social services rather than education and youth empowerment. Once again, the next cohort of young people makes the same decision as the first, leading to the same outcome, only slightly worse. Moscow is aware of the problem. Putin has called it a national security threat for years. The Russian state has launched programs to fix that, but neither of them seems to have worked so far. The Soviet-era development program for the Far East was first written in 1987. It has been revised, updated, renamed, and relaunched repeatedly in 1996, 2002, and even in the 2015 wave of institutional innovations, including territories of advanced development, the free port of Vladivostok, free land giveaways, preferential energy tariffs, subsidized airfares. This culminated in the April 2026 ministry meeting on the demographic policy strategy of the Far East. But 30 years of programs ultimately boiled down to the same issue. The model itself no longer works. Researchers of the Economic Research Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences published their findings back in 2021, 5 years before the final wave of incentives. The free land program is the perfect example of why the system doesn't work. The Kremlin offered hectares of land in the Far East to residents for free. The problem is that much of the land was offered without roads connecting it to anything, without rail access, without any infrastructure that would make it usable or livable. Russians looked at the offer and naturally declined it. Then there were wages. Russia had nominally increased wages for certain categories of workers, but Moscow has repeatedly failed to pay them on time. So the workers should get higher wages, but they end up being delayed or canceled to the point where it's uncertain if there was an increase in the first place. There were even some grand schemes, including proposals to build entirely new millionaire cities, to concentrate and anchor the Far Eastern population. But these never got beyond the announcement phase simply because there's no budget for building an entire city. And if there was a budget in place, it disappeared when Russia ended up invading Ukraine in 2022, directing its resources toward what was supposed to be a 10-day war. In fact, the war has affected the Far East on multiple fronts. The most direct impact is mobilization, since the campaign in Ukraine has drawn disproportionately from regions that were already labor scarce, and the Far East is among the hardest hit. Working-age men are the demographic most needed to sustain any kind of economic activity in a region that already can't find enough workers, and yet they have been mobilized, killed, wounded, or even fled to avoid conscription. The war has also devastated the budget as Russia's defense spending has crowded out everything else, with infrastructure being the most visible casualty. Roads are not being built. Rail expansion projects that Russian planners were discussing as recently as 2023 are stalled. The aviation network that connects isolated Far Eastern communities from each other and Russia's western regions is degrading as sanctions cut Russia's aviation industry off from western parts and expertise. In late 2023, Russia originally proposed a plan to build 1,000 aircraft for domestic and international flights by 2030. By 2025, the number of planes built was 13. The plan was quietly shelved. But perhaps the biggest factor in how the Far East is being lost is that Russia's neighbors are slowly beginning to convert the region. China has been moving into the region for years. And the Ukraine war has accelerated the process dramatically. Moscow now needs Beijing far more than Beijing needs Moscow. And the price of that dependence is being paid in the Far East. By 2025, Chinese investment in the Far Eastern Federal District is projected to approach 1 trillion rubles, or about $13.5 billion. Trade volumes between Khabarovsk territory and China grew by 5.5 million tons in 2024, and then by another 36% in just the first 6 months of 2025. China is essentially absorbing the entire economy of the Far East, funneling what should be inter-federation trade to itself. But there's an even more important factor here: population. An estimated 500,000 Chinese citizens now live between Vladivostok and the Urals. The number is growing, facilitated by visa-free arrangements and preferential access to Russia's own territories of advanced development. The economic zones Moscow created to attract investment and retain population, which have turned out to be more effective at drawing in Chinese workers than at keeping Russian ones. In several cities and localities in the Far East, Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service has reported that enclaves have formed where Russians are practically absent from the workforce. And remember, the Russians who actually live in the Far East weren't originally from the Far East. They aren't minorities who were used to living in Siberia, but were relocated there by the Soviet Union on the promise that their work would yield more money. They are culturally more similar to Western Russia than the indigenous population. And that population actually has closer ties to Mongolia or China already, though that has not necessarily made it more accepting of the new wave of immigrants. China's government arguably has the same interest in mind. Remember, before 1860, Outer Manchuria was part of Qing China. And China hasn't really forgotten that tidbit of historical context. In previous years, China went so far as to label Russian cities in the region with their previous Chinese names. Of course, that's not an indicator that China is suddenly going to invade to take back what it lost a century and a half ago, but maybe it doesn't need to invade anyway. Given that the local population is already being strained by Russia's economic policies and unequal treatment by mobilization and wartime interests. To counter that, Russia decided to use an unorthodox and possibly self-destructive tactic, replacing Russians with a different type of Eastern Asians. To fill the labor shortage in the Far East, Moscow has turned to Pyongyang. The arrangement is straightforward. Over 15,000 North Korean workers officially arrived in Russia in 2024 and early 2025, and most of them are in the Far East since that's where they're needed and closest to their home country. Unofficial estimates put the actual number closer to 50,000 by the end of 2025,